The Sunday service was in full swing. Prayers were being whispered, and hymns echoed through the church. Suddenly, the church doors slammed open. A dog, panting and frantic, rushed inside, barking uncontrollably. At first, people chuckled, thinking it was just a lost stray. But as the dog's barking turned into deep guttural growls, all laughter faded. Something was wrong. What do you think this wild dog will uncover? The most eventful day in St. Augustine Church began like any other Sunday morning. Sunlight shone through the stained glass windows of the church, and the air smelled of incense. Father Michael stood at the pulpit, nodding to the hymns. He was known for his rich sermons, but he wasn't delivering any that morning. Just like the last 2 Sundays, Father Michael had a bad cold, so the choir had to sing more hymns than usual. When the hymn had reached a high crescendo, the unexpected happened. The doors flew open with a bang, slamming against the stone walls of the church with enough force to crack the paint. The congregation squealed and jumped, and the loud choir died off. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone waited with their breaths hitched and their necks bent towards the door to see who would walk in. Who do you think it was? The jaws of the congregation dropped at the figure that walked in. It was a massive German shepherd, and it was quite a dirty one, too. It barreled into the church confidently with its muddy paws and fur, its long nails clattering on the wooden floor. The congregation released a heavy sigh of relief, and chuckles rippled through the hall. Some women clutched their chests to calm their beating hearts as they giggled. They had suffered quite a scare, and it was only a dog. "Now, whose dog is this?" the choir leader asked, and everyone burst out laughing. Someone must have left their yard gate open. Even Father Michael chuckled and shook his head. He had tensed up at the loud bang, but now his shoulders relaxed, and he wiped his face with a piece of cloth. The dog suddenly let out a loud bark, and the laughter increased. Some even screamed an amen. But the laughter did not last. Why? The dog did not stop barking. In fact, its barking became fierce. It barked louder and even began to growl. It looked like he was trying to warn them about something. What do you think he was trying to warn them about? The laughter had died down by this time, and the congregation watched in confusion as the strange dog began to jump up and down while barking aggressively. It even bared its teeth and snarled. But to make the congregation even more uncomfortable, it seemed to be barking and snarling at one person. Father Michael. The father had frozen, his fingers curled around the edges of the pulpit, which had turned white. His eyes were as round as saucers, and beads of sweat rolled down his temple. "Whose dog is that?" the choir leader asked again. She wasn't kidding this time. From somewhere at the back of the church, someone answered finally. "That's Father Michael's dog, but it has been missing for weeks." A murmur tore through the crowd. Was that really the father's dog, the same one that had gone missing weeks ago? Where had it been, and why did he look so angry at his owner? The priest didn't seem happy to see it either. Suddenly he burst into laughter. "Well, it seems even our 4-legged friends want to hear the word of God this morning," he chuckled, but no one laughed along. It wasn't only because his laughter sounded forced. Something just wasn't right. "Why is he so nervous?" a woman whispered. The man beside her shook his head. "I don't know," he muttered. They turned back to the dog and saw it had begun advancing closer and closer to the father, while still snarling. "Enough of this!" the priest yelled, his voice shaking. "Someone take the dog outside." But no one moved. Father Michael licked his lips and tried again. "Enough!" Suddenly the dog lunged. The priest stumbled backward in shock. His left hand struggled to find balance, and his right hand clawed at his chest as if something inside him had twisted painfully. And then, before anyone could react and before the dog could reach him, he collapsed. His body hit the polished wood with a sickening thud and then tensed up. A scream relocked air, and the entire congregation fell into disarray. A few ran to the pew, and an usher knelt beside the fallen priest. pressing 2 fingers to his neck. A couple of others grabbed large booklets and tried to fan him back to consciousness, but it didn't help. A younger man, a nurse maybe, began checking his pulse. They all thought he had slumped out of shock, but the truth was a lot worse. The dog had climbed up the pew with them and now stood beside the body. Then it placed a paw on the priest's robes and began to pull. "I think it wants us to give him air," someone shouted. "Loosen his robe." Trembling hands reached for his stiff collar and undid the buttons immediately. But when the fabric finally fell off, it revealed something shocking. What do you think it revealed? The small crowd around him gasped, horrified. This was a morning of surprises, but it seemed they had just discovered the most shocking one yet. That's not Father Michael," one woman stammered. "What?" The congregation behind them exclaimed. "What do you mean that's not Father Michael?" a man in the front row asked. "Who the hell is he then?" He climbed up the pew and looked down at the body. Then his jaw fell open. The girl was right. This wasn't Father Michael because there, just beneath the folds of fabric, was something their priest had never had. A tattoo. But it was not just any tattoo. It was the symbol of a well-known, violent, and notorious gang. It was a symbol that did not belong in the sacred halls of St. Augustine's or have any business with the body of a priest. The implication hit them like a hammer. It suddenly dawned on them that the man they had prayed with, confessed to, donated to, and sang hymns with was a complete stranger. "So, who is this?" Someone finally voiced the question on everyone's minds. "And where is our priest?" They looked at each other, but no one knew the answer. Except one. And he spoke up with a bark. The congregation looked down at the dog, and finally they understood. The dog knew he wasn't the priest, and he had come to warn them. But before they could thank him, it sniffed the air twice, then spun around and bolted. What scent do you think it caught? "Wait! Come back!" the congregation yelled. A few men chased after it to the back of the church, and until it stopped at a locked wooden door. They barely had time to recover before the dog began clawing at the base. "Stop that!" they yelled, but it let out a low whimper and continued clawing desperately. All the men who had followed the dog stumbled forward and tried to pull it away. All but one man, Detective James Holloway. Detective Holloway wasn't supposed to be working that morning. Like everyone else in St. Augustine's Church, he had come to enjoy the service and an hour of peace. But peace was the last thing he found. His trained eyes scanned the scene before him. The so-called priest still lay unconscious back at the church with the tattoo that Holloway recognized only too well. And now the dog who had uncovered the deceit was now desperately clawing at the door. He had seen this kind of desperation before, so he knew the dog wasn't just curious about something. It knew what was behind that door. He moved past the struggling dog and the men, trying to get it away. Then he grabbed the handle and turned it. It was locked just as he had expected. He frowned. The church could have a basement and storage rooms, maybe a furnace. But why lock it? He turned back to the men who were now looking at him curiously. "Where does this door lead?" he asked. "The old storage rooms," was the reply. "We barely use them anymore. Father Michael kept a few things down there, but—" Holloway nodded, putting the pieces together. "Does anyone have the key?" he asked, but he already knew the answer. Only Father Michael had it. Holloway cursed under his breath. There was no time to wait. If he didn't hurry, they could be too late. "Step back," he warned. Then he braced himself and kicked the door. The lock snapped, and the door burst open immediately. A rush of damp air hit them first, along with the unmistakable scent of dust, mold, and something else, something stale. The dog didn't hesitate. It bolted down the narrow stairs and disappeared into the pitch-black and windowless room. Holloway flicked on his flashlight, and the beam cut through the darkness, revealing old wooden crates, old relics, and a dusty floor. Then he saw it. Footprints. Fresh ones. Bingo! He dropped down and followed the trail, and the dog quietly. A few of the men followed him too. They had barely gone far when they heard a sound that made them freeze. What do you think they heard? It was a voice, but it was weak and faint. "Help!" it begged. For a moment Holloway thought he had imagined it, but then it came again, stronger this time. "Help! I'm here." The dog barked loudly, and for the first time that morning its tail began to wag. Holloway smiled. They weren't too late after all. They followed the voice until they found the door. It was different from the main door. This one was made with iron instead of wood. Holloway did not waste time. He drew out a pin from his belt. He always had certain tools handy, just in case. He knelt on one knee and got to work. It took a few long seconds, but at last the lock gave out and the door creaked open. The men froze at the sight before them. There, slumped against the far wall, was him, the real Father Michael. His robes were torn, his skin pale, and his eyes red from exhaustion. There were a few empty bottles before him. His small stash of food might have saved him. "Father Michael," the men gasped. "You found me," he sighed in relief. "No, we didn't." "Your dog did," Holloway confessed, while trying to calm his adrenaline. The dog shoved past them and launched itself at the priest. It nuzzled against his chest, licked his face, and let out several happy barks. Father Michael's eyes filled with tears. He buried his fingers in the dog's fur and kissed it, dirt and all. For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then someone whispered what they were all thinking. "Then who the hell have we been confessing to?" They returned to the church with the real Father Michael, and the church was thrown into a frenzy again when they heard how they found him. An elderly woman even slumped, tired of all the surprises. The man who had posed as Father Michael sat on the pew at the front of the church. Holloway had bound his wrists in steel cuffs, and he had radioed the case in too. The impostor's scared expression was gone. He now wore a smirk. "So," Holloway began after he dropped his radio, "why don't you tell us how a wanted fugitive managed to fool an entire congregation?" When he had radioed the station, they informed him the impostor was one of the men wanted in several states. The man's smirk deepened. "Because people believe what they want to," he said simply. A few well-placed words, and they don't ask questions. His arrogance and stinging smirk made Holloway very angry, but he stayed calm. The congregation had gathered, and the real Father Michael stood near the altar, leaning against an usher for support, to listen to the man's answers. His dog sat at his feet, quiet now, but still as loyal as ever. Its eyes never left the impostor either. Holloway turned back to the man in cuffs. "Why would you even want to be a priest?" "I didn't, silly. But I had to evade you blueheads somehow. I knew the priest would never agree to help me, so I made him." "You almost killed him," the choir leader yelled, but he shrugged only at her outburst. "You also planned to steal from the church, didn't you?" Holloway continued. "Of course I did. Do you think I wanted to play priest forever? Please." He rolled his eyes. "The plan was simple. Blend in, play the part, collect donations and use it to disappear, start a new life. Easy money. But that damn dog—" His gaze fell on the animal, and for the first time during the interview, something crossed his face. Not fear, but resentment. He had counted on the blind trust of the congregation and the large covering of the gown, but he hadn't counted on the dog. Father Michael's hand patted his dog's head. "You might have taken my place," he smiled. "You might have deceived my people, stolen from them. But you can never stop my dog, and you never will." The impostor's eyes darkened. The officers arrived just in time, and they pulled him to his feet. The congregation watched in silence as he was led down the aisle, the same aisle he had walked so many Sundays, speaking false sermons in a hoarse voice and offering empty blessings. The weight of his deceit hung heavily in the air. When he reached the doors, he hesitated and turned his head slightly to Father Michael. "You should have died," he yelled, and the congregation gasped one more time. But Father Michael met his gaze with a smile. "You should have known that God always watches over his own." The impostor scoffed, but there was no humor in it. Then the doors opened, and the officers led him into the waiting police car. As the doors slammed shut, the tension that had gripped the church finally loosened. A voice screamed, "Father Michael is home!" And the room erupted. They surged forward, their faces thick with emotion. Some reached for his hands, and others hugged him. Father Michael took them all in, his people, his family, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled. "I never stop praying for you," he told them. "I never stop believing help will come either." Then he knelt before his dog, before his tail-wagging, happy dog, and ran a hand through its fur. Thank you so much," he said. The loyal German shepherd had never stopped searching, and thanks to its unwavering loyalty, he was found, and justice was served. The congregation also gathered around the dog and gave it several pats. They drove the priest to the hospital and made sure the dog got a fun bath. Then they gave him many treats. Over the next few months, the story of the dog who saved the priest spread like wildfire, and many brought gifts for him. Holloway even took the dog on a tour of his station, and his colleagues gave him a salute. That fateful Sunday morning had begun peacefully, immediately turned chaotic, but ended in justice being served. But St. Augustine's Church would always remember that day, not for the uncovered deception, but for the priest who hadn't stopped believing, and for the congregation who had stood together. But most importantly, for the unwavering loyalty of a dog whose love was so pure it was willing to face a bad man alone. What do you think about this dog's incredible instincts? Could it really sense the truth? Let us know in the comments. If this story amazed you, wait until you hear about the cat that wouldn't stop stealing from a neighbor's house until they discovered why. Click now to watch. And don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable true stories of animal instincts, survival, and shocking real-life events.